The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 18, From a Murderess with Love. They left me in solitary for some days to think over their generosity. I was wretchedly disappointed. I'd been prepared to die. Now I'd been sentenced to live, and it seemed far, far worse. As a Christian, I should be rejoicing in hope. But what was my hope? Certainly in nothing I could look forward to here. Certainly not in the childish dreams I'd had at Verkhovsk, of the broad avenues of Berlin, the shops, the fine homes, happiness. That had all slipped through my fingers. I knew my hope had to be of a different kind. There was a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. He would have to keep what I'd committed to him until the day of my real deliverance. But in the same verse, the Apostle Paul had said something about the present. Be patient in tribulation. That was for right now. Of tribulation there would be plenty. What I needed was the patience. But a lifetime of it? During the day, the slamming of the cell doors and the yelling of the guards was an occasional distraction, but the nights were terrible. Somewhere a prisoner called out the names of his children, one by one. Another shrieked maledictions against a God he didn't believe in. Another, who'd received a similar sentence to mine, beat his head rhythmically against the cell wall. Other sounds, the moans, the suppressed weeping, the calls for help, were quieter. One knew by the tone that they expected no answer. Through my own mind rang the one word, lifetime. One day I was ordered out with all belongings. I picked up my bowl and spoon and was taken from my cell back to the women's dorm. This time, as I walked beneath the towering walls of the 900-year-old castle, it was with a sense of identity. Those walls would be there tomorrow, and next month, and next year. They'd be there long after my lifetime had ended, beneath their shadow. It was a bit like coming home to be together with friends again and to compare notes. No one had been released except Margareta, or so we thought. All had received sentences of stunning severity, though few as bad as mine. During the years we had shared so much and knew already how each would react. Some cried, some laughed, just on the thin edges of sanity. Others were silent, lost in an imaginary world that it would be cruel to disturb. The trials were still going on. As one by one each was called for trial and then returned, we realized that other than Margareta, there was no one to take the story of our fate to the outside world. In a few weeks, when we were all together again, we were told we could write our first letter home. Our families already knew that we were well from the card we'd sent earlier. Now we would actually have a chance to write some news, we supposed. When the 5 by 6-inch letter form with its 15 blank lines arrived, the first piece of news had already been decided for us. We must begin by informing our loved ones of our sentences. They were to be told what criminals they had in their families. As my pencil touched the paper to write the shameful news, a voice behind me said, "Write 12 years." "But I have a life sentence," I blurted out. "Write as you're told," said the voice again. I wrote the prescribed information, wondering just what my sentence was, or if anyone really knew. For the rest of the 15 lines, strict rules applied. In the first place, all must be printed. Holding a pencil and forming letters was a hard enough task for all of us, and my little bit of paper soon looked like the scrawlings of a child. No names were permitted. Another order whose logic escaped all of us. One wrote, "Has my older sister heard from her husband?" Or, "Has my middle sister found her 2 lost children?" Instead of plainly asking whether Rudy had returned or whether Sarah and Rolf had been found, the answers we finally received were equally as confusing. Even these rules were good for a smile when Hilda was called in for questioning on her letter. Since so little was permitted in the way of questions and nothing by way of news, one sometimes wrote rather simple things that might sound strange to an outsider. Hilda loved classical music and mentioned how she missed Beethoven's Eroica. Her censor must have been incredibly ignorant. In his office, he took her soundly to task for writing such a trashy letter about missing her erotic relationship with this Mr. Beethoven. Did she think such a letter would be allowed to pass through his hands, etc., etc.? We all had a good laugh when she returned. I'd never received a reply to my first card, and I was naturally anxious that this letter really reach my parents, though I regretted having to distress them with the news of my sentence. It was addressed, therefore, to my friend Malin, who'd been released from Buchenwald before my transport to Waldeheim. She was able to get in touch with my sister in Stuttgart, and to my great joy, 8 weeks after writing my letter, I received a reply from my mother. That short letter, the envelope that enclosed it, and the very feel of the paper which my mother's hands had touched, all was infinitely precious to me. The family was well. What this meant I didn't know, whether it meant the same thing as my first meaningless message, or whether it meant that all were really safe and in good health. Since only my mother signed her name, I wondered, and continued to wonder. In that first letter, we'd been permitted to request packages from home, contents dictated, of course. The excitement when they finally arrived can be imagined. The happy recipients' names were called out in the room, where we sat nightly on our stools from 8 to 10 o'clock. Because my letter had been sent in a roundabout manner, I was one of the last to be called down to the basement to receive my package. Receive isn't perhaps quite the word. We lucky ones lined up and watched as one by one the names were called, and the appropriate package was cut open and sliced in every direction. I suppose they were searching for knives or blades by which we could break out of our fortress, though I couldn't have imagined anything less than dynamite sufficing for the job. Of course, there was a long list of forbidden items and a box nearby in which to dump them if found. Maria Linke. My knees shook as I stepped forward, eyeing my little bundle. Rip. The contents spilled out 2 incredibly beautiful apples, some sugar, a package of lard, and a bar of soap. It was pink and smelled gorgeous. I reached out to take my precious things, but another hand was there before mine, and into the discard box went my beautiful bit of soap. It was forbidden. The sugar I ate by pinches. The apples I looked at. I even enjoyed the smell of the wrappings, the shape of the letters on the address, the crinkle of the paper, everything. Before receiving our first letters, we'd been put to work. My assignment, along with about 25 others, was in the sewing room. I was an expert in this sort of thing, and I reported enthusiastically. Each operation, whether it was cutting, stitching, or handwork, had its quota. I was on buttonholes, for each one a minute and a half of time, 12 stitches on each side and 2 lock stitches on each end. When we had white shirts to work on, we managed somehow. Later, when we worked on the dark blue police uniforms, it was almost impossible for the fastest to finish in the prescribed time. No matter how hard we tried, we just couldn't fulfill our quota. Since the privilege of writing our monthly letter depended on it, the motivation was there, but not always the eyesight to thread the needles, nor the strength to keep the fingers flying. In a moment of inspiration, someone suggested a work pool. Half of us would help the other half fulfill their quota. That way, at least half of us were sure to have letter privileges every month. It seemed a great idea until it was discovered. Thereafter, our shirts were marked with our prisoner number. Again, somebody came up with an idea. We would double the thread and make only half the number of required stitches. Discovered again. No one must deviate from the prescribed pattern, or the consequences would be terrible. So in the end, bureaucracy won out, and we had to depend on sheer speed. I returned to the dorm from the sewing room one day, completely exhausted. I'd no sooner really mastered the buttonhole business than I'd been switched to sewing the trousers of men's suits. It was exacting work, too, but I was proud already of my progress and dreamed at night of making my father and Fred a really nice suit when I got out. A 12-year apprenticeship should qualify me for that, I thought. This evening I wanted nothing more than to sprawl on my stool and relax. When I walked into the dorm, I found 50 new civilian prisoners added to our number, many of them convicted of murder, all guilty of the most vicious crimes. Scared to death of these women, we all went on a hunger strike. When the commandant heard of our rebellion, he stormed over to our barracks. "These criminals have killed only one person," he explained. "That could happen to anyone. You are guilty of the killings during the war, so they're the ones who should complain." I knew I was guilty of the crime of capitalism, according to their definition. I had been a homeowner. I'd always thought a capitalist was someone who didn't himself work, but lived off the labor of others. Who could have worked harder than I? And that bit of property I'd criminally called my own had been so pitifully small. That little house had probably had less square feet than Mullen's rented apartment, yet she'd been let out. It didn't seem fair. Of course there was that matter of working hand in glove with the Russian traitors, as they'd made out at my trial. If that was my guilt, then most others shared it too. And that wasn't fair either. How sorry I felt for myself. Now this. Why, they even got slices of white bread while we got our usual heavy black loaves. I definitely looked upon the arrival of these miserable women with an uncharitable and certainly non-Christian eye. Life was so hard anyway. Nobody to the toilet without special permission, no talking in the dorm, the precise folding of our jacket and pants at 10 p.m., the long freezing wait until midnight when we were allowed to go upstairs, the impossibility of a good night's sleep with so many people in one room. Every night there was an uproar of some kind to keep us on edge. Someone was in pain or had had a nightmare that her husband had remarried. Or our commandant ordered us all out of bed to rush down to day quarters and refold our clothes. There was the sewing room pressure, the dread of interrogation. Now life was to be made even more intolerable by the nightly fear of being murdered in our sleep. I reacted with a good case of gastritis. At least that was the diagnosis when I was at last allowed to consult one of the doctors. Maria, what you really need is to get off this heavy dough. If you had white bread for 4 weeks, and if you'd calm yourself down a bit. Both suggestions seemed impossibly remote. The next day there was a wonderful surprise in the drawer of my sewing machine. 2 slices of white bread. Every day the surprise was repeated, until a month had passed, and with it my gastritis. Later I learned that one of the women, a convicted murderess, had found out about the doctor's verdict and had shared her bread with me in this way. I'm sure that my more forgiving attitude had as much effect on my recovery as the bread. I was never afraid after that to close my eyes at night. To be so many years without either Bible or pastoral care had its effect on all of us. Even for unbelievers, the presence of God's Word and His servants in a community or a home has a wholesome influence. Repeatedly we asked for a church service. The answer was always the same. The day came, however, when we women were led to a large auditorium, carrying our stools with us, a joyful expectancy in our hearts as we waited for the promised service. Would the pastor be one of our own? We had several in camp with us, or someone from the outside. We could hardly contain ourselves as we awaited his arrival. He came in, flanked by 2 guards. One look at us, and he couldn't keep the tears from flowing. Astonished, I wondered why he was upset. I was so happy. It took a moment to realize that we must have presented a rather surprising and ludicrous sight with our stubby hair, thin faces, and jackets and trousers that were never changed. More problems with his voice now when he announced the first hymn. It was such a glorious thing, this business of singing freely. We all opened our mouths wide and began lustily. Then a strange thing happened. One by one the voices became silent until all of us were weeping, overcome by the glorious privilege of attending a church service. I don't remember what the pastor said, or if he was able to say much of anything, but God spoke to our souls in a way which was beyond speech. At the close we sang Martin Luther's great hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." The fortress which was Waldeheim couldn't contain our spirits when we sang those words of praise to our strong deliverer. Every word of every verse seemed to apply to us. The meaning and our enthusiasm didn't escape our guards either. At the 3rd verse our service was broken up, and we were led back to our barracks. As in every old castle, Waldeheim had a church, and rumor had it that despite our foolish behavior at the first service, there might actually be another one, this time conducted in the ancient Gothic chapel. The men were scheduled before us, though, and an incident took place at their meeting which almost cost us our turn. They'd been led in, 400 privileged men, no doubt with the same emotions of expectant joy and sad recollection that we had experienced. The pastor had taken his place behind the pulpit and opened his sermon with the words, "Though you are people who have wronged your country and have been tried for your crimes, you will someday return to society and a useful life." He could get no further. A voice had called out from his audience, "No politics! We don't want to hear politics!" Others joined in with the same complaint until there was a general tumult, with the guards running up and down the aisles to calm the prisoners. When all was quiet at last, the pastor asked, somewhat shaken, "Shall I continue?" He could hardly know how novel it was for the men to be asked for permission to begin again. When they answered, "Yes, but only from the Bible," he must have made a rapid readjustment of his message. There were no more interruptions. Nevertheless, that was the first and last time that he came to Waldeheim to attend his dictatorial flock. We women didn't have much hope after that of ever getting inside the beautiful chapel. From the outside we could see the stained glass window. From the other side we knew it must be even more lovely. When a friendly guard passed the word that chapel was planned for us after all, and on the very next Sunday, we women in the sewing room made the work fly. I was by now almost an expert at turning out men's trousers, and knew I could fill my quota. Even so, time passed especially slowly that week. When Sunday came, I, along with the other privileged ones, entered the exquisite Gothic structure, and I stepped into another world. From the harsh glare of naked light bulbs to the soft rays of sun through stained glass, from jarring prison sounds to the glorious organ music echoing from arch to arch, I sat down overwhelmed. So great was the ministry of Christ's everlasting love that it would have been hard for me to imagine heaven more beautiful to the eye or the ear or the spirit than that dank little chapel in Waldeheim prison. Time passed. I felt a nudge. "Do you suppose we won't have a service after all? After what happened before, you know?" I shrugged my shoulders. It seemed hard to imagine any greater blessing than I was receiving right now. At that moment the pastor was brought in. In front of the pulpit he turned around to face his congregation with outstretched arms. "I will never leave you nor forsake you," he called out, the tears running down his cheeks. There was an electric reaction among us, as if the voice of Christ himself had been heard, promising his own presence. All understood why he refused to go to the pulpit. He wanted to be as close to us as possible. The pastor took Hebrews 12:11 as his text. "Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby." When he read the verse, he lingered at the word grievous, eyes closed, voice choked with emotion. I knew that he understood our suffering and wanted to reach out and somehow identify with us. Christ spoke to me that day through that humble man. The tears in his voice and eyes told me that he knew something of the compassion of Jesus Christ, that whether we were great or small sinners, political prisoners or social outcasts, it was all the same to him, and that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ was as great a miracle to him as it was to any of us. He came several more times. After each service, he stood at the back and reached out to touch each one of us as we left. One day he departed from form and from our lives. At the end of his message, he gave an invitation to any who had not received Christ to do it then. None must think that any sin, no matter how great, could separate a repentant heart from God's forgiveness. Instantly, the service was ended, and the pastor led out by the two guards. I didn't see him again. I didn't expect to.